Okay, good morning. Time for us to get our today's presentation started. Today's presentation is a pathway to business success through inclusive marketing. Our presenter today is Brandon Campbell of Brandon Campbell Communications. The slide is not that messed up on me, and I apologize for that. So for those of you who are not familiar with SCORE, SCORE is a volunteer organization, national organization with about 100 volunteers in Chester and Delaware counties. Our goal is to help foster a vibrant small business community. We provide mentoring and educational services to small and startup businesses. Our vision is to assure that every person has the support necessary to thrive as a small business owner. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be made available to you in a follow-up email from SCORE after today's session. All listeners have been placed on mute to avoid any distractions. If you have any questions for our speaker, please place them in the Q&A box so we can follow up on them and keep track of them. Any comments or references that you'd like to share with the rest of the audience, please put in the chat box. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Brandon Campbell helps businesses build and articulate commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion through her DEI consulting firm, Brandon Campbell Communications. She draws from over 15 years of experience working with clients worldwide to provide actionable solutions that center equity and inclusion throughout their communications and cultures. Her BA in political science and MA in international relations highlights a lifelong interest in learning about the interplay of different systems, practices, and cultures in human stories and relationships. As a speaker and strategist, Brandon works with clients worldwide to provide solutions to infuse DEI throughout their systems and cultures. Organizations that have benefited from Brandon's experience include organizations such as the NFL and Fortune 500 companies. With that, I'd like to turn today's presentation over to Brandon.
Thank you so much, Adam. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really excited to talk to you about the topic of inclusive marketing. It gets at the heart of the work that I do relating both to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as my own role as a fellow business owner. This is a topic that I find hasn't been discussed a lot. So by starting to think about and wrap your mind around inclusive marketing, you will have a leg up on your business against some of your competitors as you think about the changing landscape of the of your customer base. Today, I'm hoping will be a conversation. I'm not a terribly formal person, so feel free to put any reactions or things like that that you have in the chat box. We will have time set aside specifically for questions, and we will move forward. I'm going to pull up my slides. Okay, one moment. Oh, pardon, that was middle of the deck. Okay, here we go. So this is the presentation that you know you're here to see. And before we get started, I'd like you to take a moment to think about this phrase, inclusive marketing. Is it something you have heard of before? Is what comes to mind when you think of the term inclusive? And those are questions we will answer when we dive in. So take a moment with this slide. It's a lot of words, I realize. But in having this conversation, it's important to think about what comes to mind when we think of traditional marketing versus what is meant when we talk about inclusive marketing. So marketing, as most of us know it, is defined as any actions a company takes to attract an audience to the company's product or services through high-quality messaging. Marketing aims to deliver standalone value for prospects and consumers through content with a long-term goal of demonstrating product value, strengthening brand loyalty, and ultimately increasing sales. That's how HubSpot defines marketing. So that's many of the things you probably already do and are familiar with to get word out about your business and to drive in customers. Inclusive marketing is slightly different. It's creating content that truly reflects the diverse communities that our companies serve. It means that we are elevating diverse voices and role models, decreasing cultural bias, and leading positive social change through thoughtful and respectful content. And that is how Salesforce defines inclusive marketing, and they do a really good job of it. So in layman's terms, marketing tends to be thinking a lot about the message we want to put out and getting it out there on our website, on social media. Inclusive marketing is more engaged, more interactive, and it's really surveying your audience and thinking about, I don't mean literally doing surveys, but thinking about who your audience is, who are the customers who come to your business, who do you want them to be, and being really thoughtful about including them in your marketing. And we will be talking today about ways to do that. When we talk about being inclusive, it means we have to think about all the ways that we are different. There is a lot of talk currently about diversity and inclusion, and a lot of that focuses on very few factors, but diversity is so much more than that. And so being inclusive needs to, there needs to be awareness that there's more than that. So I love this graphic because it helps us to think about the ways that we are different. It's an iceberg and this waterline of visibility. The characteristics that are above the waterline are what we tend to think of when we think of diversity. And beneath the waterline are some important reminders that there's a lot more in the ways that we can and the ways that your audience can be diverse. So it's something to consider. So for example, above the waterline, if you just think of the surface of a person, you can tell my race. You can tell or assume my gender. You can see the color of my skin. You can make a general guess at my age, and hopefully it's younger than what it is. But you don't know for certain. And then it's really interesting, these characteristics kind of right at the waterline, kind of above and beneath. Nationality, physical ability, ethnicity, you can see there are a lot of things that maybe we can make some assumptions, but not necessarily. And then there's so many things that you can't tell at all. You don't know, and using myself as an example, you don't know my marital status, my political views, my education. You don't know my sexual orientation, my thinking style. So these are some of the things to think about. I don't say that to overwhelm you. We are small business owners. We don't have diversity leads and diversity teams, but it's helping to think about your audience as a whole, and your audience as part of society that constantly changes. And even so, for instance, physical ability on social media. Some of you may be doing this now. If you're not, it's something I encourage you to look into. A relatively recent change is realizing accessibility challenges. If you have something on Instagram, for instance, not everyone is able to see and read clearly. So there are devices that some of your customers may have to help them read when they are looking at social media. And if you have an image there that they can't see, that's a problem. So when you are loading a caption on Instagram now. You can put, and on Twitter and all the social media platforms, you're encouraged to put what's called alt text, and that's something that readers can scan and find and read a description of the image for those who are visually impaired. So that's a really practical application of inclusive marketing. It's acknowledging that not everyone is going to be able to see this. What might we be able to do there? So this is not to overwhelm you and let you think you have to accommodate all of that, but it's to think of what can I reasonably do to include as many people as possible. As a society, your audience is going to, as is the case with society, your audience is going to evolve. So your marketing should as well. Inclusive marketing is recognizing that marketing isn't static. And I think traditional marketing in a lot of ways kind of was pretty static. You do perhaps your marketing plan and you execute it, and you're not stopping necessarily to think about your audience as a whole. How are their views changing? If you think about companies and our society, let's compare the 1990s to where we are now. We can all agree that there's been a ton of change. And so if you were marketing today as if it was still 1990, you probably wouldn't be doing so well. So this conversation is encouraging to think about what's changed and what can I do to meet that change? We talked about inclusive marketing. It's also important to just have a definition of what we mean by when we talk about inclusion. I love this definition that's from Ferris State University that says it's involvement and empowerment where the inherent worth and dignity of all people are recognized. An inclusive environment promotes and sustains a sense of belonging. It values and practices respect for the talents, beliefs, backgrounds, and ways of living of its members. So let that think for a moment. That complements what we've been saying about inclusive marketing and the definition shared. And it's really about trying to make everyone feel a part of it. I talked about scrolling on Instagram and can give you an example of why this is important. If I am following a brand and I never see anything that looks like me or my lifestyle reflected, I'm going to lose interest. I'll probably stop following that brand because it seems like they have no interest in speaking to me, which is likely unintentional. And it also seems like what they're talking about doesn't relate to my life and my experience. You don't want people to think about that when they see your marketing. You want them to be able to see themselves and show, we know that you're a busy mom, for example, and we're going to have you represented here. We see that maybe you have a different learning style. You're neurodiverse. We are recognizing that. I mentioned changes in society, and this will put a lot of this in context. We are in an election cycle. No one has been able to escape with all of the ads. We can even see from the public discourse how different society is right now from where we were even 10 years ago. A lot of the reason for that is so much has changed, and I like to call that the future is here. You have likely heard about demographics changing in the next several decades and that making a big impact. And that's already happening. Gen Z, those are individuals born, forgive me, I forget the exact date ranges, but it is young adults. It's through folks born to 2012. It is the most diverse generation in American history. 48% of that generation identifies as basically people of color. BIPOC is an acronym you may have heard of. It stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So half of this generation is, some folks use the term minority. I don't love it. We're coming really close to the point where minorities are no longer going to be a minority. That's going to be a huge shift expected to take place in the next 20 years or so. But significant changes around that are already happening. So if we talk about Gen Z, this generation that is almost half people of color, they're going to be 40% of consumers by 2026. We have heard a ton about millennials, and we've seen the impact that millennials have made in changes to workplaces and the way companies market. And that's going to continue with Gen Z. Gen Z is really concerned about social issues, things like global warming, and that drives their purchasing decisions. Many of us were taught when we were growing up, we don't talk about social issues. Some folks think social issues is the same as talking about politics. Gen Z has grown up kind of seeing the ugliness that has taken part around the world relating to social issues. So they kind of have no choice but to take a stand because it's really their future. And 50% of consumers, Sprout Social has done some research on this. They want brands to talk about their social justice commitments and be proactive in talking about their progress. So it is a very different landscape for businesses. And we saw that in the summer of 2020, in the aftermath of the horrific murder of George Floyd, and then the statements companies were issuing, trying to recognize that in some way. And a lot of times they were off the mark. They didn't have a good sense of who their audience was. They hadn't been active in really trying to be inclusive in their marketing, and they fell flat. And that's really what we're talking about and talking about trying to avoid. So inclusive marketing is part of that know, like, trust for your audience that is so critical for business owners and especially small business owners. You're showing that you see and value diverse audience members. You're not just talking to people who look just like you. You're not talking to just one group. You recognize that it's a diverse society, it's a diverse world. Things have changed, and you are wanting to be holistic, really, in your approach. I'm going to pause really quick to see if anyone has any comments or questions that they'd like to put in the chat. And then after that, we will move into a little bit of an exercise so you can see what I'm talking about in action.
Okay, so Brandon, I don't see any questions currently. If any of our audience does have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We'll be checking for them periodically during our presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Adam. So we're going to go ahead to an example to make this information a little bit more concrete. So I've talked about society being really different and the ways that we market being so different from, for instance, 1990s to now. A great example of this, Band-Aids, and if you would believe it, ballet shoes. I don't know if any of you have young ones involved in dance, or perhaps you did dance yourself. But up until very recently, if a kid got an injury or an adult, when you went to get a Band-Aid, it was this kind of beige color. It blends in perfectly on this child here, but if I had a boo-boo, that would make it stick out even more. And that's just the color, that's all that was available. Same with ballet shoes. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and she is involved in dance, and not at the point she needs professional ballet slippers, but when you get to that point, you very often need those that match your complexion. These Band-Aids, the ballet slippers, have been called for decades nude. And so that's why I call this exercise Nude for Whom? Because that's certainly not the color of my skin. Brands were pretty much going forward with one audience in mind, and that's just how it was. The demographics of the country were very different. There was a much more significant majority of folks who were identified as Caucasian, and not that it was right to exclude other folks, but it's just how it was. And we didn't know any different, none of us, and so we just went along with it. But just in these two examples, these huge, the Band-Aid company and ballet shoes were excluding huge portions of their market, people with Black and brown skin. And that's just how it was. Today, things look a little bit different. If you go to get Band-Aids, there are choices in the colors. Johnson & Johnson finally in 2020, their response to the racial protests that were happening, decided that they were going to release different shades of Band-Aids. So now you can get them in many different shades. I have seen them at Target. It is, I have to say, a little bit exciting. Same with ballet shoes. There are brands that started specifically to service folks who didn't see themselves represented in other shoes. So now it is possible to find nude that matches your shade of nude. This, is so common. For instance, for women, pantyhose. I didn't even know if that's a thing that was still worn. We've all been in our homes more than usual the past couple of years, and I needed to get some pantyhose for an event coming up. And that still goes by nude for the beige, and everything else is kind of an other. And by not kind of making these acknowledgments to things being different, for there being more diverse audiences, for folks demanding that they be seen and represented, if Johnson & Johnson had stuck with those tote Band-Aids, they would have lost out on the market. There are companies that have created bandages with different skin tones ahead of Johnson & Johnson making their change. And same, there were brands that came up with the ballet shoes, as I mentioned, because they realized this isn't helping everyone. There is a big part of the population not being helped. So these are examples with products, and I'd love for you to think about what might this mean for representation in your marketing. Does everyone look the same? Think about your community. Does everyone look the same? What are some things that you can do to begin to include more folks in that marketing and in your images and efforts and in the message that you are using to connect with folks? See that there's one question, so I'm going to pull that up. So,
so Judy asks, in your personal business experience, have you worked with anyone from the diaspora in another cultural group who speak English but with a cultural accent?
Okay, I have done that. I have encountered that. I've done some work internationally, and I love this question because it also reflects that when we think of even the term African American isn't necessarily descriptive of all of the Black folks who are in the United States, for instance. If you're, I assume your business is marketing to folks within the US. So yes, that is something I have worked with, Judy. And I have worked with people from the diaspora who speak English with an accent. And there are some significant differences there. And it's always helpful to be able to talk about those. Is that answering your question? And hopefully so. Okay, I hope that was helpful and got to the point of your question. But yet there's so many different kinds of diversity, and it can feel really overwhelming. But the first step is kind of realizing, maybe I could do a better job here or do something different. One second. Did this. Okay. So I raced through this more than I had planned, but your audience members want to see themselves in your content, and no single image can convey that. More importantly, they want to know that you see them. And that's what this whole discussion is about. What are some ways you can make people feel included and more included in your messaging so that they connect with your business and move from that know, like, and trust and can become your customers? So this is a fascinating topic, and here are a couple of resources you can use to talk about this, to learn about this a little bit more. I have a few closing words that I'll use, and hopefully there will be some more questions so we can have a conversation around this topic. I find that's most helpful in solidifying some of these ideas, but here are some of the some of the resources. I'm going to stop sharing and just say a few other notes. So one thing, yes, absolutely, Judy, it is really crucial to be inclusive, and there are a lot of businesses that want to have a checkbox, so to speak, want to do, okay, we did our diversity thing, and that just no longer is going to cut it. I know a lot of business owners that I speak to are terrified of being called out, like what happened the summer of 2020 on social media, or they don't want to be called performative. I don't think anyone is holding any of us to a standard of perfection. It doesn't exist. I have a 3A framework that I use in my business that just talks about we all are moving through a cycle of acknowledgement, awareness, and action. All we can do is kind of acknowledge, this is something I could work on. I could do a little bit better. You grow your awareness. I encourage anyone who goes through this presentation to think about, to do a sort of audit on your marketing. I don't mean to put even more work on the overflowing plates of small business owners, but it doesn't have to be anything extensive. If you do have Instagram, for instance, I keep mentioning that because it's something I tend to use a lot in my business and work with organizations. And the visuals are very easy to look at together and get a feeling. Maybe do a little bit of an audit. Look to see, do I have some, am I talking to different perspectives or different lifestyles? Am I acknowledging that there may be some different ways that people need to be acknowledged through my messaging? Am I being, are my visuals kind of, are they targeted to multiple demographics? This is not something that's kind of performative. There's no checkbox. That's a really important point. There's no point where you just check, I'm done. This is really ongoing. Just get in the practice of really evaluating. Take a look at the followers of your account. What do they look like? A great part of social media, I think, is that you can, if the profiles are public for some of your followers, you can look and see what their lives are like. You can get some market research for free. And no one is saying you must have all of the answers immediately, but perhaps you identify one area where you realize, okay, I could do a little bit better. For instance, for me and my business, I realized I was not doing a great job. I mentioned the alt text for folks who were visually impaired. I was inconsistent with when I put an image description and when I didn't. And that was unfair, and that's not inclusive. So what I have been sure to do this year is to be sure that that's something I do for all of my posts. It can't just be, oh, well, I don't have enough time. Well, then I can't make that post. So find a place to start. And then as you learn more, you don't know what you don't know, But as you learn more, you can then radiate out and be even more inclusive. Look at who your customers are and then look at your marketing. This is a conversation to really encourage you to be holistic in your approach, because this is, if we go back to that slide, the future is here. This is where we are headed as a society, in business. The businesses that aren't giving any thought to this are pretty quickly gonna start to see that they're gonna lose to the people who see that you care about them, that you're making an effort to talk to them. So this is your way to kind of get ahead of things. It's no longer an option not to speak to or make an attempt to be inclusive. So think about what are some ways that you can incorporate this into your own marketing. So I would love to hear if there are specific questions. It's a really big topic. And hopefully kind of seeing those examples, Nude for Whom, hearing a little bit about the alt text can be helpful. One other example I'd love you to think about is with, and this is a reflection of how quickly society changes and how we have to adapt to it, the use of pronouns. That is something that, let's say 3, 4, 5 years ago was not happening, at least not on a wide scale. And by that, I mean, you'll see in people refer to themselves as she, her. I have that in my email description. That's recognition that not everyone identifies as he or she. Some folks will go by they, them pronouns. And by sharing your own, you make it more comfortable for folks who aren't, who are non-binary. That's a discussion we weren't even having 5 years ago. So as society evolves, we have to think about ways to evolve our own business and our own practices. Are there any questions? I know this is a lot to process. Any questions?
Yeah, please enter your questions in the chat box. We have more time left, and we have a small audience today. So please feel free to ask your questions. I'll throw in a couple examples of diversity issues that are not visible. So the below the water items is a significant portion of the population is colorblind. I work in a business where we publish lots of charts and graphs, so we have to make a point of not only using color, but using patterns in our lines and so forth, just so that everybody can tell which line is which on our graphs. You know, another example is I've had coworkers who are dyslexic. You can't tell so telling them something's on the left or on the right doesn't work. You need to think of other ways to express location and orientation to be meaningful for them. So as you rightly pointed out, Brandon, not all of our diversity issues are visible, and so we don't always know what we need to address.
Definitely, and thank you for sharing those really, really great examples. And I like that your example about dyslexia really points to, as small business owners, sure, there's the marketing component, but if we are able to have employees, that we need to think about what inclusion means in that respect as well. That's a little bit broader than the discussion we're having today, but that is a really great point, and I'm glad you shared it. I will bring up one, I'm going to say last example, but I may come up with another one, another example of why this matters. We do have a small audience, so not to put anyone on the spot, but this is a great time to really have a discussion and get any specific questions you may have answered. But this is something from my own experience. This is with a membership organization. I had been a part of it for a year, had a reasonable experience, but wasn't sure. It was up for renewal, and I was considering, do I want to stay involved in this organization? And I went to their social media channels. I went to their Facebook. I think they were more active on Facebook. I was scrolling through a little bit. My local chapter wasn't at all diverse, and I was curious what the wider organization looked like. This actually happened in 2020, I believe the fall. I was looking at the members who were highlighted, the chapters who were highlighted, and I saw no one that looked anything like me. So that's one thing. A lot of folks may have been enough. It may have been enough for some people to be like, this isn't for me, and move on to something else. Because I do this work, I always enjoy, if I can, engaging in a conversation. So I reached out to my chapter leader and share some of my concerns and said, what is the view of the organization? I haven't heard anything about kind of all that's happened this year. I don't see diversity in the membership. It was kind of politely asking, how can I see myself in your organization? Or does your organization have space for people like me with my experiences? Unfortunately, it was kind of brushed off like, oh yeah, we don't make statements. We don't have a stance on this. And that was kind of it. So as you can guess, they lost my business. So there are different ways. If that organization said, you know what, we actually didn't realize that we weren't highlighting other members. This is something we care about. We just haven't figured out how we want to approach it. That would have been fine. Most people are not asking for perfection. They just want to know it's on your radar, or if you bring something up that you're open to it. If you show it, I'm not really interested in hearing about your perspective or including you, that speaks volumes. And most people won't take that extra step of asking the question. They'll just make assumptions based on what they see from your marketing. So that is going to be my last example. And if there aren't questions, I believe Adam has some additional things to share.
Yes, thank you, Brandon. Let me share my screen, and there we go. So for those of you who are interested in getting mentoring support from SCORE, and again, mentoring services are available free of charge. You can go to our website to see a list of available mentors, or we will pair you with a mentor if you would like help with that, or you can call our office at the number there, and we would be happy to set you up for free mentoring services, and mentors will meet with you and help you go through whatever issues you would like help for in running or starting up your business. So please feel free to take advantage of our services. Again, we will be distributing a video of today's presentation to all the attendees and everyone else who's registered. So you should see that later on today, most likely. And before we go, I would like to ask you, I would also like you to fill out this poll for me before you sign off. And we thank you for attending today's session. And we thank Brandon for sharing her very excellent content and experience with us today.
And thanks everyone for being here.